Hello, everyone. We are here today to discuss we're having a public hearing on hiring practices and background checks. And so we want to welcome everyone in joining us in person or on the Facebook live stream. We're here to discuss the Policy Advisory Report on MMPD's hiring procedures and to take public comments about the report. I want to introduce Dr. Peter Valier and Ms. Liz Orozco. There are two ways to give feedback during this meeting. You can comment on our Facebook Live or by leaving a voicemail message at 629-255-1906. If you are watching on Facebook, please feel free to share this meeting. And we're going to begin our discussion here with some questions for our research analysts in our panel. So Dr. Valier. How do you approach conducting police oversight research?
Thank you. I'm excited to be talking about this report. This report's been a progress for the past few months and has been a really good one to work on. We approach research from trying to draw from best practices that are established around the country, as well as existing research from academic sources and other sources as well. But we also recognize that we try to take a really community-centric approach to research. And so we are working on developing a framework to really try to assess how we do research and how we make recommendations. So this report actually introduces a framework that we've developed that places community at the center. And surrounding community, we have 5 pillars of 5 values that we try to reflect in all the recommendations that we do. And those are accountability, transparency, justice, equity, and evidence. And we try to operationalize these because, so when we talk about community is reflecting the diversity of Nashville's community. We're trying to maximize the input from community and ensure that the community is shaping the policies that Metro government is creating and the types of policing that is happening in Nashville. Accountability means that all government entities are accountable to the people that they serve, and that includes both at an agency level and an individual level. So at the agency level, what agencies are doing and how well they're doing them are central to when we talk about accountability. And at the individual level, how people are treated, if people are treated with respect, lawful, and equal treatment is foundational, and then having a process to make sure that that happens. Transparency is also core to that. In order to have accountability, transparency is key. Without having a transparent culture and proactive culture of transparency, there's no way for the public to hold their government officials accountable. So we aim and we value that type of transparency. When we talk about justice, we are talking about a multifaceted lens that emphasizes human rights, fairness, and minimizing harm and healing when harm occurs. And so we draw on perspectives of social justice, racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, distributive justice, restorative justice, procedural justice. And each of those has theories behind it, and we draw on those. When we talk about equity, we try to bring an equity lens, meaning that we try to focus on identifying where inequalities exist, the root causes of those inequalities, and ways that we can change those inequalities in the future. And finally, evidence is a pillar that we really try to focus on. We really try to focus on using the best evidence possible. And all of the reports that we do and that the COB issues are based on a rigorous analysis and evidence. And we draw on published research. We do original analysis in our office of criminal justice data. And we also draw on lived experiences of impacted people, because that's important evidence for understanding how people are impacted by their government. And we, in our recommendations, often try to encourage a robust data collection and research to improve outcomes. So this is the perspective that we're taking towards doing research focused on oversight. And I think it's important to sort of frame out all of the recommendations in this report as drawing on those pillars and centering on community.
Thank you for going into detail about that. I'm sure everyone can agree that those pillars are super important in any discussion you have about this type of work. So I forgot to say, I'm Jill Fitchard with I'm the executive director, and we're just really, really happy to be here. This is our first in-person meeting, and so we're just very grateful for this opportunity to share with you all. So I have a question for Liz. Liz, the question is, can you talk about the NAACP's request for this report?
Sure. So the NAACP raised concerns about the standards that are used to vet the applicants to the MMPD. And this was in response to the hiring of Officer Nathan Glass, who prior to becoming an officer was working as a security guard at the Pharmacy restaurant in East Nashville and was involved in the shooting of Mr. D'Angelo Knox in October of 2018. And prior to that shooting, Mr. Glass was offered a spot at the MMPD's Police Academy training class, and that offer was delayed while an investigation of the shooting was conducted. And although Mr. Knox's death was ruled a homicide, the district attorney's office decided that Glass had acted in self-defense, and that case did not proceed to the grand jury. So after that decision, a month later, MMPD did hire Mr. Glass in March of 2019. And last year, the NAACP became involved in the case with Mr. Knox's family and their attorney, and they brought attention back to the case, pointing to video evidence and forensic evidence, stating that this was not in self-defense. And they also pointed to social media content on Mr. Glass's social media accounts that showed some support for militia movements and possible racial bias as well. And so last year in October of 2020, after finding out the prosecutors were reviewing the case again, Police Chief John Drake decommissioned Officer Glass, and in November of 2020, Glass was indicted on one charge of second-degree murder for his involvement in the fatal shooting of Mr. Knox. And so this incident raised broader questions about the role of background investigations and what types of past events are disqualifying for employment with the department. And that's really what this report focuses on, those processes and the types of investigations that are done on applicants.
Okay, thank you. So could you give us a general overview of the hiring process?
Yeah. So we found that there were 8 main phases of the application, a hiring process for the MMPD. It starts when an applicant applies online through Metro Government HR, and their information is sent to the department. And then in step 2, the department sends an applicant a personal history statement packet, which is a 35-page packet with a range of questions and releases about prior work experience, different life experiences, and that packet is due at an applicant's civil service testing date. And at that civil service testing date, applicants complete both the written civil service test as well as a physical agility test in the same day. And applicants that pass that test, both parts of the test, are then assigned to a background investigator. We discussed in our findings, these background investigators are part-time retired officers that apply to become these background investigators for the department. And once they're assigned an applicant, they'll use the personal history statement packet to conduct their investigation. They'll set up a structured interview with the applicant. And during this phase, an applicant's social media accounts are also reviewed. Then, once an investigation is done, it's presented to the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel. This panel is comprised of all the Deputy Chiefs of Police as well as the Director of OPA, the Office of Professional Accountability. And they'll review an applicant's packet. If they have further questions, they'll ask for more information. But if not, they can vote on whether an applicant's qualified, disqualified, or deferred. And in order to move forward at this phase, an applicant needs 4 of 6 votes of qualified. So if an applicant is voted as qualified, they'll receive a conditional offer of employment, and that needs to be signed before they move on to phase 7 in our chart here, which is a psychological test, a drug screening, a medical exam, and a CVSA, which is a computer voice stress analyzer exam instead of a polygraph. And those results are then presented to the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel again in a final panel, and the results are presented by the behavioral health manager, the medical examiner, the CVSA examiner, and the HR director. And if there are no further questions on an applicant, then they'll vote to give that applicant a spot in the next training class.
I just have one clarifying question. You
Sure.
said they would be voted, the vote would be 4 of 6?
Yes.
And the 6 are all the background investigators?
No, so that's the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel. So you have
Okay.
the Deputy Chiefs of Police and the Director of the Office of Professional Accountability.
Okay, gotcha.
And you do need 4 of the 6 votes as qualified to move forward.
Okay, all right, thank you for that.
Sure.
So Peter, what does the data show about the hiring process?
So we looked into some of the data that was provided from the department to the Mayor's Policing Policy Commission that covered 2016 through September of 2020. And it gave aggregated numbers for each step of the hiring process. And so we pulled data out of the spreadsheets that were provided and created data sets to try to look at each stage in the process, to look at whether there were racial and gender disparities in who was, after application, who was taking the civil service test, who was moving on in the process, who was being disqualified in the process. So what we found was that only about 1/3 of applicants take the civil service exams or even show up to the civil service exams, which is pretty low, is lower than some of the published research from other departments. And what we specifically found was that Black women were the least likely to show up to take the exam. And so women overall were less likely, but Black women in particular were less likely to show up to the exams, which moves them out of the hiring process and limits the ability to move forward and diversify the force. For passing the civil service exams, so the civil service exams are calibrated so about 80% of people pass. And we found that in 2020, there were no racial or gender differences in passing the exams. But for preceding years, so 2016 through 2019, we did find that Black women were less likely than other groups to pass the exams. Once the background investigations are taking place, we found that Black men who were applicants were most likely to be disqualified. When we pooled across the 5 years of data that we had, Black men, only 43% of Black male applicants qualified, where for the rate for all applicants was 56%. Hispanic men and Black women also have lower than average qualification rates of 45% and 47%. So what we're able to show with these numbers is not that we can't show the reasons why necessarily, but what we can show is that there's some discrepancies that need more study and more focus in order to make sure that that qualified people are making it through the process and that biases aren't leading to some people moving along when others are being disqualified. So we want to make sure that everyone is moving forward who's qualified to move forward. And then what we also found that in the first 9 months of 2020, 93 officers were hired, or officer trainees were hired, and these were the applicants who were hired to enter the academy. And 73% of those officers were white men. And in the preceding 4 years, so 2016 to 2019, white men comprised 63 to 67% of all new hires. So in 2020, that number increased. And percentage of applicants or a percentage of new hires who were women and people of color declined. So that shows that there are some disparities in the hiring process that we were able to identify with the data. And while we can't, with the data that we had, look at some of the causal factors, what we can do is we can help identify where those exist so that moving forward, more attention can be given to those areas and that hopefully those can be decreased.
So I want to have a follow-up question, and I know that you can't speak on specifically, but could you speak on some of the disqualifiers that you know of?
Absolutely. So the most common disqualifier is actually about arrest history. So there are specific charges that disqualify somebody from being certified as a police officer in Tennessee. And those have to do with driving under the influence, stealing. So theft is a permanent disqualifier. For other arrests, or misdemeanor arrests, if they're expunged and they don't fall into specific categories, then there can be a waiver from the Peace Officer Standard and Training Commission, the Post Commission, and they can still be certified as a police officer. Where sometimes there can be a concern is making sure that people understand the process of what it takes to expunge a record,
Right.
and that some arrests can be expunged or misdemeanor citations can be expunged, and if that information is not given out equitably, that could affect people in the hiring process.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, I'm going to pose the next question to you, Liz. Now that we've discussed some of the findings of the report, let's turn to the recommendations. So you have broken these down by the part of the hiring process. Is that correct?
Yes. So our first two recommendations are about the personal history statement. And like I said before, this is a very important part of the background investigation process. It's helping the investigators focus on problem areas and red flags that they might see about an applicant. And so we had a couple of recommendations that we felt would make the personal history statement packet stronger. And our first one is about including questions for people that may have been law enforcement officials in another jurisdiction. And we think that these questions should include the topics of unnecessary use of force, bias-based policing, and any disciplinary actions that they may have faced elsewhere. I think this recommendation is really important for people that may have served elsewhere, especially because it is very hard to obtain personnel records from other locations, especially if someone's coming from out of state. So we think that that should be included, especially because there's also a release in questions about military service. And so I think it makes sense to sort of mirror that and also include a section about prior law enforcement service. And then our second recommendation is about specifically question 99 as it's written now in the personal history statement. It's about whether an applicant has a bias that they think might affect their job performance. And we think that there could be much stronger questions on the personal history statement about bias and how behaviors and attitudes really might impact job performance or your ability to be a police officer. And so we have some example questions in our report as well, such as, have you ever used racial slurs? Have you ever made demeaning comments about a person based on their sexual orientation or gender presentation, as well as several others here. So I think, we'd like to see MMPD dig a little deeper with applicants about their attitudes and behaviors.
Okay.
And we have a comment.
Okay.
We did have a public comment that was related to that, and that came in as a voicemail. So I'm going to play the voicemail as loud as I can, and hope it will show up on the YouTube stream, but I'll repeat some of the content for afterwards for the Facebook live stream. And just as a reminder, if you are listening to the Facebook Live, please feel free to leave a comment, and if you have any comments or questions, we'll address those as we're talking.
Hey there, my name is Jess Nolan. I'm a Nashville musician and resident for the last 6 years. and a current member of Surge and Nashville Musicians for Change. I'm just calling to voice my support for the recommendations and have some thoughts on expanding them. Specifically on recommendation 2, the wording of this one might be improved by acknowledging that prejudices and biases exist within all of us, and maybe we can ask how that has come up in the applicant's work life and how they have personally worked to address this. On the number 5 and number 6 recommendations, might be useful to come up with a concrete plan for increasing diversity using percentages and a defined timeline for when the changes in the makeup of investigators will happen. I think there's more room for accountability here and ensuring that these changes actually happen. Thank you so much for your work, and I look forward to seeing these recommendations improve the hiring process for MNPD.
All right, and so just to reiterate what the comment said, the comment was saying that on recommendation number 2, that there might be including acknowledgement of implicit biases and asking an applicant to address how they might have their understanding of implicit bias or how they may have addressed that in their previous work life might be a good avenue for trying to address that, to make sure that that folks who are applying to the police department are to understand their level of awareness about their own biases coming in. Also, there was a comment about recommendations 5 and 6 that that potentially adding percentages or specific benchmarks might be a way to strengthen those recommendations. And we appreciate that comment and think those are great recommendations.
Thank you. Liz, I just had a follow-up question regarding the personal history statement. I know that we have a lot of lateral transfers that come in, and they have lateral classes as well at the training academy. Do you know if the background checks are similar, or are they different? Are they specific because of them already having that law enforcement background and transferring from another department?
Yeah, so I will say the lateral classes didn't necessarily come up during our interviews with MMPD. It's, to my knowledge, they do get the same personal history statement packet. The HR director, Sue Bibb, did talk to us a lot about obtaining personnel files and how they'll call departments, and if they're able to, they will go in person to review personnel files at other police departments. But yeah, I think for the personal history statement, they don't receive different questions.
Okay, thank you. All right, and on to you, Dr. Valier, civil service testing recommendations. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so recommendations 3 and 4 of the report focus on civil service testing. As I mentioned in the data, when I talked about the data, we found that civil service testing rates, only about 1/3 of applicants show up. And so we recommend that MMPD should evaluate the reasons for civil service testing no-shows through surveys and interviews with individuals who did not show up for testing. So reaching out to the folks who did not show up in order to get more information about why and see if there's barriers that could be easily addressed. And then our recommendation goes on and says, when impediments are identified, changes to the process should be considered, and if made, an evaluation should be in place to assess whether change was effective. And then MMPD should aim to have at least 50% of invited applicants take the civil service tests. The 50% number is in line with some of the published research on other departments, but if they can exceed that, that would be fantastic. As many people as show up to take the tests would be beneficial. And we identified a few potential ways from other research that could be implemented. I think it's important, the evaluation plan is important. What we saw in some of the published research was that some departments have made changes in their recruitment process that have actually led to reductions in taking civil service exams. So if a change is made, it's important to know whether it's actually increasing the number of people taking it, if it's having no effect, or if it's decreasing. And if it's decreasing the number of people who take it, then that should be changed back, or something new should happen. So really having a clear evaluation plan and some data in place to make those changes and know when they're effective and when they're not effective is guiding this recommendation. We also discussed in the report recent changes to the agility requirements used in the civil service tests. And beginning this year, the department has changed some of the physical agility requirements to be more realistic compared to the actual expectations of police officers. So there's an obstacle course, a short sprint, things that are more aligned with what the expectations are. In the past, there was a 2-mile run, which officers should not be doing a 2-mile run on shift. If they're, in a foot chase, those are usually short. So to better align, as well as to potentially decrease gender bias. So one of the requirements was completing 20 push-ups. And some of the research has shown that that might contribute to gender bias in passing the civil service tests. So those changes, we recommend that there should be they should publicly release their planned evaluation report that focuses on whether changing those physical agility requirements reduces gender and racial disparities in attending and passing the test. And I think it's important that, there is a plan to evaluate that already. And so we're recommending just to be proactive and transparent about what those results are.
Thank you. I have a couple follow-up questions, but just really one. So you talked about the civil service testing and how there's many no-shows, specifically towards Black women. Can you tell us more about the civil service testing, or who administers it, or how it's created, and can someone study for the test?
So there's two components of the civil service test. There's the physical agility section, and there's a written portion, and those happen on the same day. You arrive and you take the written exam, and that's it's focused on a few specific areas, but it's not a fact-based, or it's not a law-based test. It's not police procedures. It's focused on character, decision-making, ability to think through the questions, those kinds of integrity kinds of questions. Trying to identify who's a good applicant and who may not have the necessary qualities to be a police officer. The physical agility portion has several different events, including a obstacle course, a short run, a dragging a 100-pound dummy like 100 feet. So there's a series of physical agility that would be pretty standard for a police officer to have to complete on the job. Also, on the day that they show up for the civil service exam, it's required that they submit their personal history statement, which is the 35-page packet. And that also requires notary to notarize that. So there may be some simple changes, like making sure that there's a notary available at the civil service testing who can notarize the packet, and that's included when it says that it needs to be notarized. So if the first page says there will be a notary present when you turn in the packet, that might reduce one small barrier that could be a challenge for somebody to have the document notarized before going to civil service testing. There may be other simple things like sending a text message reminder the day before, or changing the due date of the personal history statement. So the personal history statement could be due 2 weeks after the civil service testing. So some of these small changes could be evaluated to see if they actually have an impact. And through a series of these small changes might actually accumulate to having an additional 14% taking the exam, which would meet the, the recommended 50% that we have in this recommendation.
Right. Yeah, eliminating barriers would be, fantastic. On to you, Liz. Background and investigation and interview recommendations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so our next few recommendations are about the background investigation and interviews. And so like we mentioned before, the background investigators themselves, at the time of our interviews, there were 14 background investigators. 4 of them were women and 10 of them were men, and only one of those men is African American. Everyone else is white. And so we thought that important recommendation to make would be to increase the diversity of these background investigators that work with the recruitment section, especially having them be retired police officers. That might also skew them to be a bit older in age, and we think it's important to make sure that those investigators are on the same page about the type of people that the department's looking to recruit now, and those goals that they have for diversity. Our 6th recommendation is about conducting at least annually a review of the demographics of applicants that have been assigned to these investigators and the number of disqualifications that each investigator is producing in their investigations. And this review might show that a particular investigator might have higher disqualification rates for a specific demographic group compared to their other investigators. And this doesn't necessarily indicate that they have a particular bias, but it could lead to a more in-depth audit if needed. And we think it's important to use that data that they have from previous years. And our 7th recommendation is about the review of social media accounts and content during the hiring process. That is not currently in the SOPs or standard operating procedures for the recruitment section. And we think it's important to add that to their SOPs and make sure that there's a standardized process that's equitable for each applicant. And we also talk a little bit about how the International Association of Chiefs of Police suggests that if an applicant is refusing to share their social media content or accounts, that applicant should be disqualified from the process. And that's obviously becoming a more important part of the investigation every day as people share more and more of their lives online.
That's a good point. As it pertains to social media, I think that there's a policy that not only Metro government has, but isn't there a policy that the police department has regarding social media?
Yes, there is a current policy for officers and what they can or can't post on social media, and they can face disciplinary action for that as well. But that's not a standardized thing for applicants.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's interesting. All right, Peter, let's talk about the DCOP panel recommendations.
Yeah, so this is an important step in the process following the background investigations. And the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel is making the decisions about whether someone is qualified to be a police officer or not. And this is really the opportunity that the department has to make sure that the people that they plan to hire meet the standards that the department has set. And our 8th recommendation is specifically related or specifically geared to address the situation that led to this report that the NAACP brought to us. And that is that if a applicant is subject of a criminal investigation after they're reviewed by the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel, regardless of the investigation's outcome, so even if it was found to be self-defense, that the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel must review the incident in the context of the applicant's full background investigation and re-vote on whether the applicant is qualified. So in the situation that had occurred, there was already a finding that he was qualified. However, that incident might have provided new information that in the context of the rest of his background may have indicated that he may not have been qualified. And so in that situation, hopefully, if this were in place, the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel would re-review would re-review the information and would not, would make a judgment. And that judgment may be the same, it may be different, depending on the specific instance. But this would provide another step of accountability and another decision point. Our ninth recommendation is that the executive director of the Community Oversight Board or their designee should be a voting member of the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel. And I think this is an important recommendation because as we center community and the Community Oversight Board are representatives from the community should be a part of vetting the police officers as they're being hired. And having that voice that reports back to the Community Oversight Board and is accountable to the Community Oversight Board and who's directly accountable to the community is an important step of that process. And the executive director of the Community Oversight Board is already on the, is a voting member of the Force Review Board, so is on the back end accountability, and this is more on that front end accountability, right? So as applicants are coming into the department or are being evaluated later on. And the 10th recommendation from the report is that the recruitment section standard operating procedures should address conflicts of interest of the Deputy Chiefs of Police panel and direct panelists to recuse themselves from deliberating or voting on applicants' qualifications when they have personal or business relationship with the applicant. And so one concern that we've heard from community members is that there might be nepotism in hiring, or if someone is biased towards a particular applicant, they might not be vetted to the fullest extent. And so this recommendation is to try to ensure that if someone does have a relationship, that they would recuse themselves and that process would go forward fairly with people who don't have previous knowledge of that applicant. And hopefully that would encourage trust that the process is not biased in specific directions, and that some people are not getting an upper hand or not treated as fairly.
Thank you for that. I know that in the civil service rules, they do address nepotism in general, but not specifically like you're making in your recommendation. So I appreciate seeing that one. And so lastly, Liz, give us some of the general recommendations.
Yeah, so we have one general recommendation number 11, that focuses on the PreAcademy Employment program. So we talk about this program in our report. This program's existed a little informally in recent years, but MMPD has recently formalized an employment program where applicants who have been approved to go join the training academy can be employed in an administrative, non-sworn role at the department in the few months before they start their training academy class. And this program now includes a physical fitness routine, a curriculum that has educational materials for them that will help them in the training academy, as well as a mentor who is a sworn officer who can help them get acclimated to the department and talk to them about what to expect in the training academy. And so our recommendation is that the MMPD should evaluate this PreAcademy Employment program now that it's been formalized to determine whether it improves academy outcomes and early employment outcomes compared to people who do not participate in the program. Is that giving people a higher success rate, and release this report to the public as well.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
So I'm assuming that a lot of people may not know about the PreAcademy Employment program, how to apply, or if it's paid employment. Can you tell us a little bit more on what you found out about it?
Sure. So the PreAcademy Employment program, now it's been formalized. I believe it's offered to applicants that have been approved for the next training class. You join as an administrative employee, and you're earning the police officer trainee salary, which is $42,259 a year, which comes out to about $90 an hour. And their really pushing this program, I think also as an option for applicants that are from out of state. A lot of people apply to this job and maybe they've already given notice at their previous job and they're moving to Tennessee. And so this helps sort of fill that gap between being approved for the academy, but having to wait maybe 3 months before you actually start. And so I think, you know, it's a great step in terms of retention and keeping people around before they actually start.
Good, that's good to know. Thank you so much. We did have one public comment. I'm going to read that, and then we'll take any community input or comments. So this one comes from Melissa Cherry. It says, "Thanks so much for your work on this policy review. I was appalled at the precipitating incident and am grateful that steps are being taken to create change that could prevent such a thing from happening again. In particular, I commend the data analysis in this report, which shows that there are racial, ethnic, and gender disparities in the hiring process that should be evaluated and addressed so that the goal of diversifying the police force can become a reality. Unless and until measurable and impactful steps are taken to create a space that is safe and welcoming for candidates, recruitment will continue to be a challenge. Regarding personal impact statements, I appreciate the focus on adding law enforcement background questions and would love to see the policy improved by acknowledging that prejudices and biases exist within all of us and creating the opportunity for applicants to exhibit their knowledge and practice of this reality by giving personal examples of overcoming or addressing their own biases or holding coworkers accountable for how this impacts their work in whatever field they come from. Additionally, I would recommend a commitment from MMPD to work with MNCO to identify and agree upon implicit bias testing that can be administered as a preliminary step of application. Regarding the recruitment section of investigators, it is alarming that there is little representation from populations that would be directly impacted by common prejudices in our society. It might be useful to come up with a concrete plan for increasing diversity using percentages and a defined timeline for when changes in makeup of investigators will happen. Additionally, having an agreed upon definition of the word diversity would help to track successes in this area. Lastly, an investigation into the possibility of conflicts of interest or familiar connections within both the recruiting and HR departments of MMPD seems incredibly important based on a demographic disparity both of recruitment and advancement and the staff themselves. Thank you again for your work on this important matter. Melissa Cherry, resident of zip code 37207. We want to thank her for that. And so, do you want to have any closing remarks or talk? We don't have any public comment. If we had any more community calls in or anything like that? Okay.
I would just close by inviting anyone who's watching to, if you do have feedback, to please, look at the report. If you do have feedback, to please get in contact with us. You're always welcome to email us, leave a voicemail, or call our office. We're always happy to have conversations about the work that we do. Also, we're happy to discuss other research or other concerns that community members might have around what is being researched or what potential future research topics. So please do reach out if you have any questions, and we're always happy to have those conversations with our community.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on that. We are having our monthly board meeting, and that is on the 26th of this month. It's at 4 p.m. It'll be in this particular room or the next room, but it'll be at the Sonny West office building. And so we welcome you to come out or even just call us in advance leave your public comments on the number that's posted with this. It's important as we move into going back to having in-person meetings that we get as much community involvement and engagement as possible. We're here for you, and we want to continue to do the work of this community that we love and that we're here and committed to. And so these research reports are important. I believe we're voting on that coming up soon. And so if, like Peter said, if you have public comment, if you have anything that you want to add to this report, please get it into us as quickly as possible, because I think the next reading of it will be on the 26th. Anything else, Liz? You have anything? All right. Well, thank you all for showing up, and share, and we appreciate you. Bye.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.org.